They said the wind didn't blow that night. It just watched. Out where the land cracked like old skin, and the sky bled out in red streaks, the fires burned low and mean. Dry Knife Ridge stood hunched against the horizon like a tired spine, jagged and unmoving, while the scrub brush whispered secrets to the dirt. Coyotes kept their distance. Even they knew something wrong was about to happen. Tessa stood barefoot on the dust, her wrists tied in front with horsehair rope. Her eyes, wide and steady, swept the circle of men around her. She did not weep. She did not beg. 16 winters had taught her that tears only made pain louder. The men who stood around her were not strangers. Her uncle, Nantan, stared into the fire, jaw clenched and eyes hollow. Her cousin held the rope that bound her hands, his grip so tight his knuckles looked carved from bone. Not one of them would meet her gaze. She wasn't being stolen. She was being traded. Rufus Kane stepped forward, a man who looked like he had chewed glass and liked the taste. He wore a coat made of black hide and spurs that whispered when he moved. His hat was low, casting shadow over eyes that flickered like oil and flame. His mouth curled when he looked at Tessa. Not quite a smile, not quite anything human. "She'll do," he muttered, tossing a small sack to Nantan. The weight of it rang with coin, silver most likely. A man behind Kane chuckled, his laughter thick with rot. Another spat tobacco juice near Tessa's feet. The trade was made with no ceremony, no prayer. Only smoke, dust, and silence. Rufus nodded, and 2 of his men stepped forward. One was lanky, with a scar across his lip. The other had eyes like stone and a grin too wide. They reached for her, but Tessa didn't flinch. She made them come to her. "She'll bite," one warned. "She'll learn not to," the other replied. They turned her roughly, tying her to one of the pack mules. The animal flicked its ears, but didn't move. It had seen worse. From the edge of the light, a figure stood alone, half-shadowed beneath a dying juniper. He leaned against a broken fence post, one boot crossed over the other, a worn hat pulled low. Boone Harlan watched the whole thing and said nothing. Years back, he'd ridden with Kane. Rode hard and mean. Folks still whispered stories about the things he'd done down in Waco. But Boone had gone quiet since then, like a revolver buried in cold ash. Still dangerous. Just waiting. Kane didn't acknowledge him, nor did Boone step forward. He stayed where the fire couldn't reach his boots. Tessa turned her head just enough to see him, just enough to remember that someone else had witnessed her being given away like a broken tool. She didn't know who he was, but she saw something in him that made her pause. Not pity. Something quieter. Something waiting. The caravan rolled out before moonrise, Kane's gang moving like vultures in the dark. They numbered 7, not counting Boone, who hadn't ridden with them in months. He kept to the shadows, showing up only when the moon was thin and trouble thick. They didn't light torches once they left the circle. Rufus led the way, eyes cutting through the dark like a coyote on a scent. Tessa rode slumped on the mule, rope cutting into her skin, but she didn't make a sound. Every jostle was a bruise. Every whisper behind her was a threat. She listened to the way they talked, short, mean bursts of speech about cards and whiskey, and what a girl like her might fetch down south if sold clean and quick. She filed every voice in her memory, matched them to footsteps, habits, and smells. One man carried juniper oil on his coat. Another always coughed before he spoke. Scar Lip muttered to himself when he thought no one listened. Somewhere behind them, Boone Harlan followed. Not close. Not far. Just enough to keep their dust in sight. By dawn, the sky opened wide and hard over the red rocks of Broken Mesa. The gang made camp near a dead spring, where a ring of gray stones told of water long gone. Kane barked orders. The others scattered to make coffee and check gear. Tessa was tied to a mesquite tree. She didn't sleep. She watched. Boone didn't show. Not yet. Scar Lip came near with a tin cup of something foul-smelling and shoved it toward her mouth. "Drink or die of thirst. Don't matter much to me." She took it, drank slow. He squatted beside her, watching her mouth too long. She met his eyes, and something in her stare made him shift. "She ain't scared," he muttered. "She should be." Another outlaw laughed. "Let Kane break her. She'll scream eventually." The days bled together. Dust, silence, firelight, the sound of horses, the smell of grease and sweat, and men who thought themselves wolves, but moved like pigs. Tessa did not cry. At night, she studied the stars and memorized the way the land sloped, where shadows fell first, how long it took for the fire to die down. She knew Cain was waiting to find a buyer in a town called Calico Flats. 2 days' ride, maybe 3. She'd be sold again before the moon turned fat, unless something broke the pattern. On the 4th night, Boone Harlan sat by a fire alone, just out of sight of the others. He cooked coffee in a dented tin and stared into the flames like they owed him answers. He hadn't spoken to Cain, not in days. Not since Waco, really. But he watched the girl. He saw how she never whimpered, how she learned the names of her captors without asking, how she waited, not like prey, but like someone counting heartbeats. Boone wasn't sure why it mattered. He'd buried better folks than her. He'd done worse to quieter girls. But something about this one. She reminded him of a time before the blood, before the whiskey dulled the edge of memory. She looked like a daughter he never raised. That night, Scarlip tried to touch her. Not much. Just a reach, a whisper, something ugly. She bit his hand so hard he screamed. Blood hit the dirt. Rufus Cain stepped in with a backhand that cracked across her face. Do that again, he hissed, and I'll pull out every tooth one by one. Boone stood then. Just a shift in weight. Just enough to make Rufus look his way. You got something to say? Cain asked. Boone didn't answer. He sat back down, poured more coffee, eyes unreadable. Rufus spat. You're just here for the trail, old man. Don't forget that. Boone didn't nod, didn't blink. But Tessa saw it. Saw the way the quiet man held his cup. The way his hand tightened just once. Like a noose pulled halfway. When they rode out the next morning, Boone vanished again, into brush and rock, a ghost on the trail. Tessa rode with a cracked lip and fire in her chest. She didn't know his name, but she knew this much. He had seen her, and he had not turned away. The canyon air burned cold after sunset, the kind that cut into bone and made horses restless. Boone Harlan crouched beside his mare, one hand pressed to the animal's trembling flank, the other swabbing blood from a gash just above the knee joint. She'd kicked wrong coming down the slope, caught a sharp rock. Now she wouldn't bear weight, and her breathing was shallow. Boone didn't curse, didn't sigh. He just worked in silence, hands steady, jaw tight, the same way he had during gunfights, surgeries, and funerals. The fire he'd built was small, hidden among boulders that curled like fists in the broken gut of Angel's spine. The stars above were hard and cold, scattered like splinters across the black. Somewhere up in the cliffs, a wolf cried long and low, but Boone didn't flinch. He wasn't afraid of wolves. He was afraid of remembering. The trail had been quiet for weeks. He'd taken to riding alone, miles from towns and roads. No one chased him anymore. No one spoke his name unless they did it in a whisper. Boone Harlan, once the steel behind Rufus Cain's rage, the man who held the shotgun at Waco while Cain lit the church, had vanished from memory like a storm that passed too fast. He wasn't sure why he'd stuck around these canyons. Maybe it was the silence. Maybe it was the feeling that the rocks here didn't judge. They just stood, red and still, the way he wished his heart could. The trader came limping through at dawn, half-conscious, hoarse, foaming at the mouth. His shirt was torn and dark with blood, one eye swollen shut, the other blinking through dust and shock. Boone pulled him off the saddle and gave him water. Didn't ask questions at first. The man spoke between fits of coughing. Cain, he's gone cruel. Took a girl, young one. Apache blood. Quiet thing. Like she knew already what was coming. I tried to stop it. He shot my brother instead. Boone's hands went still. The trader didn't notice. He's heading south. Said Calico Flats. Gonna sell her. She don't scream, just stares. Like she's not waiting to be saved. Like she's measuring the world. Boone didn't respond. He gave the man some jerky, splinted his leg, and pointed him toward the ridge trail that led north. You'll make it if you ride slow, he said. If you don't, then Godspeed. Once the trader vanished into the dust, Boone sat for a long time beside the fire. The mare's breathing had steadied, but she wouldn't carry him far. He looked at the saddle, at the rifle, at the old leather pack worn smooth by years of running. He hadn't saved anyone in a long time. But he remembered Waco. He remembered a girl not so different, same age, same silence. She hadn't lived. Her name was lost to him, but the smell of burning pine pews and the sound of sobbing under gunfire never left. He saddled up a younger gelding from a small corral he kept beneath a dry ledge. Threw in beans, cartridges, water skins. He didn't say a word. Night fell like a curtain, and Boone rode into it. The wind screamed through Angel's spine after dark. It didn't moan like in other places, it screamed. Sharp, short bursts that sounded like names. Boone kept his hat pulled low, scarf around his mouth. He rode with the ease of someone who didn't need to see the path anymore, someone who had memorized the feel of the land under hoofbeats. Every canyon bend, every stretch of cracked salt bed, every rock that caught moonlight like a blade. He knew them all. Coyotes tracked him for a while, then gave up. They knew he wasn't worth the trouble. The stars wheeled overhead like silent witnesses. His shadow stretched long and strange across the sand, and Boone thought of the girl. The way the trader had described her, silent, watching, waiting. He didn't know why it rattled him, but it did. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was something deeper. Something he didn't have words for anymore. He remembered holding his own daughter once, just days old, wrapped in a shawl made of Navajo cloth. She'd lived only 6 months before fever took her. That had been before the gunfights, before Kane, before the part of Boone that knew how to love went quiet. He pushed the thought away like a bottle he didn't want to touch. By the second night, he crossed the old railway cut near Barlow's Gulch, a place where bandits used to hang lanterns to lure trains. It was quiet now, just sand and rusted spikes. Boone stopped briefly, checked his bearings, and let the horse drink. The moon was a sliver, low in the west, casting barely enough light to see. He kept moving. No fires. No sleep. He ate jerky in the saddle, sipped water, chewed tobacco to stay alert. The trail left by Kane's gang wasn't hidden. Boone knew how they moved, fast, arrogant, careless. They believed they were untouchable, that no one would come after them, especially not an old man with a bad knee and a scar that split his shoulder like a broken tree branch. But Boone wasn't after justice. He wasn't after redemption. He just couldn't sit still anymore. By dawn on the third day, he reached Snake Jaw Ridge and found the remains of a camp, cold fire pit, boot prints, a length of rope half buried in sand. He dismounted, studied the ground, and found a spot where someone small had knelt. A girl, based on the depth and shape. She hadn't moved much. Her prints stayed clustered, like she'd been tied or watched too closely. He traced the path west. South of the ridge, the land dropped into dry ravines and thorn brush flats. Buzzards circled high and slow. He saw Kane's trail clear as daylight. 8 horses, maybe 9. Boone mounted and followed, eyes narrowed, every movement deliberate. He passed a broken wagon near noon, half-burned, with bullet holes in the side. Flies hummed around a carcass, one of Kane's men, judging by the coat. Shot in the back. Left to rot. Boone stopped only to check the body's face. He recognized him. Wallace Grigg. Mean, twitchy. Always laughed when someone screamed. He didn't say a prayer. Just moved on. As the sun dipped toward the horizon again, the canyon walls turned gold and bloody. Shadows stretched long like old regrets. Boone made camp under a rock ledge, fed the horse, leaned back with his rifle across his knees. He hadn't spoken a word in 3 days, but the silence inside him was changing. He no longer felt like a ghost, just riding to ride. He had a shape again, a reason to keep going. He thought of her, not by name, but by image. A girl staring down devils, not crying, not begging, just waiting. It made his chest tighten in a way he didn't understand. When he slept, he dreamed of fire, of pews collapsing, of a voice crying his name, not in anger, but in recognition. He woke before dawn, saddle already packed. Boone Harlan rode on, alone as always, but not aimless anymore. Tessa learned quickly that fear could be quiet. It wasn't the screaming or the fists that shook her. It was the way Kane's men laughed after, like it was just another chore, just another step on the road. Days blurred beneath the sun, and the trail stretched forever through dry gullies and wind-scoured flats, where nothing grew and nothing gave. The heat pressed down like judgment, and the rope on her wrist stayed tight. They didn't beat her often. They didn't have to. They wanted her frightened, not broken. She was worth more whole. She watched. Every moment, she watched. How Rufus Kane rode, with one hand always near his belt. How Scarlip drank before camp, but never during. How two others played cards with their backs to the fire, never looking at her, but always speaking loud enough for her to hear. They treated her like a coin they hadn't spent yet. That made them careless. They didn't know she remembered everything, every face, every boot tread, every stubbled laugh and whispered slur. They didn't know how her mother had taught her to wait, how her father's blood had taught her to bite when cornered. Kane had said they'd reach the border in 5 days. South of Calico Flats, there was a man who bought girls without asking questions. That's where she'd go, unless something stopped them, unless someone did. On the 5th night, the wind changed. It came down the canyon like a warning, sharp and cold, carrying the scent of smoke that didn't belong to them. The men noticed, too. They circled tighter, slept with guns laid across their bellies, eyes flicking toward the darkness. Boone Harlan was near. No one saw him at first. That was his way. He moved like fog, like something the land had grown and then forgotten. He watched from a ridgeline at dusk, his horse quiet beneath him. The camp below flickered in the dying light, tents crooked, voices low. He saw Tessa, hands bound, back straight, seated near the fire like she belonged nowhere and everywhere. Something cold twisted in his gut. Boone didn't believe in saving people, but he knew debt when he saw it. He waited until the light went purple and long. The men grew loud, careless. Rufus disappeared behind a rock wall with a bottle and one of his men. Scarlip argued about cards. The others grunted over stew. None of them were looking up. Boone slipped down the slope, feet sure on the loose shale. He tossed a stone to the east, and the sound cracked through the dark like a shot. Half the men scrambled toward it, pistols drawn, spitting curses. Boone moved the other way. Tessa looked up. Just a flicker of her eyes. A blur in the dark crossed behind her, tall, lean, wide-shouldered. A hand reached out. The knife was swift. The rope at her wrist split in a whisper. She didn't scream. She just moved when told. They ran. The camp erupted behind them like a hornet's nest. Shouts, gunfire. But Boone had already planned the route. He didn't ride into the open. He moved down into Devil's Hollow, where the canyons coiled like a snake and no sound traveled right. His horse thundered through the dusk, Tessa clinging to him, arms wrapped tight, face pressed into the smell of leather and old blood. They didn't stop until the stars bled white over the Badlands. An old mining shack leaned against a rock wall like a drunk too proud to fall. Boone dismounted, pulled Tessa down gently, checked the trail for dust, then ushered her inside. She stood in the center of the shack, breathing hard, not speaking. The place smelled of rust and bat droppings, but it had a roof and one wall still strong. Boone lit a lantern low. His face looked older in the flickering light, creased, weathered, eyes sunk deep like twin wells. "You hurt?" he asked. She shook her head. He noticed how she didn't shrink, didn't cry, didn't even thank him. He nodded, pulled off his coat, handed it to her. "You'll get cold. Nights bite harder out here." She took it, but slowly, suspicious. Her hands trembled, not from weakness, from restraint. Boone found jerky in his saddlebag and a canteen. He placed them near her, without a word, then stepped outside to keep watch. The moon slid across the black, like a silent ship. Boone listened to the coyotes and the wind and the long space between. He hadn't meant to do this, but once he saw her, he couldn't not. Back inside, she ate in silence. When he returned, she was sitting cross-legged, watching him the way a wolf watches a man holding meat. "You one of Kane's?" she asked, voice low. "Was. Why not now?" Boone rubbed his hands together. "Because I got tired of the taste of blood." "You kill them?" "Some." She nodded, as if that made sense. "He'll come. He'll track us." "I know." She steadied his face. "Why'd you come for me?" Boone hesitated. The truth wouldn't help her. "Not yet. I owed someone," he said. "You reminded me." She didn't ask more. Just nodded again and stared at the broken boards of the shack. Boone watched her. She had a scar under her eye, thin as a whisper. Her hands were small but calloused. She looked like she should be afraid of everything, but he'd seen enough to know she was waiting for something worse. "You ever fired a revolver?" he asked. She glanced up, wary. "My mother shot rabbits," she said. "She made me learn. Didn't teach me how to shoot men." "You pointed the same," Boone said. "You just don't blink when it kicks." He reached into his satchel, pulled out a small Colt, light enough for a child. He held it flat in his palm. She took it slow, checked the cylinder like she'd been taught. Her grip was unsure, but her eyes were not. "We won't stay long," Boone said. "They'll send trackers. I'll teach you while we move." "Why teach me?" "Because I can't be everywhere. And Kane's not the only devil in these parts." She didn't answer, but she didn't put the gun down. At dawn, the shack vanished behind them, swallowed by rising dust. Boone led the way on horseback, Tessa riding beside him now, not behind. She said little, but watched everything. How he scanned the skyline, how he listened before cresting each ridge, how he touched the ground with 2 fingers to read prints like scripture. By the second night, they camped beneath a bluff with firelight flickering against stone. Boone showed her how to clean the Colt, how to track with her ears, how to listen for silence, not sound. She watched. She listened. And when he wasn't looking, she smiled, just a little, because for the first time in days, no one looked at her like a thing to be sold. And Boone, staring into the fire, thought of the girl at Waco who hadn't been saved. But this one was still breathing, and he'd ride through hell to keep it that way. The wind changed as they crossed into the ghost of Calico Flats. It carried ash this time, soft and bitter, like old sorrow rising from the ground. Tessa lifted the scarf over her mouth, squinting through the pale dust as Boone slowed his horse near a charred foundation. Nothing but blackened beams and melted glass remained of the old church. He dismounted without a word. Tessa followed, stepping over cracked stone and twisted iron. The bones of pews jetted from the earth like ribs. Sunlight pierced through the frame, casting long shadows across the ruin. She could almost hear the echoes, bells that no longer rang, voices that had once risen in prayer. Boone walked to what was left of the altar. His boots crunched on shattered tile. He stared at the spot like it held something sacred, or something broken he could never fix. "This is where it ended," he said, voice dry, "and where I should have done something." She looked at him, waiting. "Years back we rode through here. Me, Kane, and the others. Thought we were chasing a bounty. Thought this place was hiding him. But there was no outlaw. No threat. Just a village. Families. Women. A church full of scared people." He lowered himself onto a splintered step and rested his hands on his knees. His face looked hollow in the filtered light. "I didn't fire the first shot," he said. "Didn't light the fire. But I didn't stop it neither." He looked up at her then, and in his eyes was a wound older than any scar. "My wife was here. With our daughter. She'd come ahead of me by 2 days. Wasn't supposed to stay long, just visit her sister. They died in that fire. Burned with the rest of them. And I." His voice cracked, just for a second. "I stood outside, holding a rifle, too afraid to speak. Too loyal. Too blind." Tessa stood very still. The wind tugged her coat. She looked down at the blackened ground. "My mother told me about you," she said, quiet. "Years ago. She said a white man once came to our village. Didn't take food. Didn't ask for anything. Just fixed a broken saddle and left. Didn't even look at the girls." Boone tilted his head. "She said he was strange. Kind. Said if I ever ran into him, I should listen close. Because men like that don't last long." Boone breathed out, not a laugh, but something like it. "She said your name. I remembered it when Kane's men spoke it." Her voice grew stronger, and I watched, and I waited. They didn't speak for a long moment, just stood in the broken church with the ghosts of fire all around. Boone finally stood and moved to the far wall, where rusted box lay half-buried beneath rubble. He pulled out a tin of ammunition and a pair of rifles, wrapped in scorched cloth. "Storm's coming," he said, "and Kane's not far behind." Tessa took one of the rifles. It felt right in her hands now. That night, the moon bled pale through tattered clouds, and the world held its breath. They made camp inside the ruin, the walls shielding them from wind, but not from what was coming. Boone taught her how to set traps in the brush, where to place the rifles for crossfire, how to feel the ground for approaching hooves. Then they waited, side by side, guns across their knees, hearts heavier than the sky. The first shot came just after midnight, a spark of muzzle flash in the dark. Boone didn't flinch. He returned fire clean and fast, dropping one of the shadows moving through the trees. Tessa ducked, then rose like she'd done it 100 times, placing her shots just as he taught her. The rifle cracked like thunder. One of Kane's men screamed and fell. They came in waves, for maybe 5, shouting and firing blind into the night. Tessa moved like a ghost, reloading behind a fallen beam, eyes sharp and steady. Boone moved slower, age in his bones, but still deadly. He dropped another 2 before a bullet tore through his side. He stumbled, caught himself on the altar. Tessa cried out. He waved her down, blood blooming across his shirt. "They'll rush now," he rasped. "Hold your ground." And she did. When they came close, she fired again, once, twice. Scarlip went down with a grunt. Another man caught buckshot in the leg and howled like a dog. The rest scattered, spooked by the girl who wouldn't miss. Then the quiet fell, thick and sudden. Smoke lingered, drifting over the ruin like a shroud. Tessa crawled to Boone's side. His breath came rough and wet. She pressed her hands to the wound, but it bled too fast, too hot. His skin was pale beneath the grime. "You're not dying here," she said through clenched teeth. Boone looked at her. His lips cracked into something like a smile. "You shoot better than me," he whispered. "Shut up. You remember what I taught you. All of it. Then you'll make it." His eyes flickered. Somewhere behind them, hooves approached. Not wild, not scattered. Just one horse, riding steady and sure. Tessa looked toward the broken doorway. Rufus Kane stepped out of the dark, rifle in hand, long coat dragging dust. He saw the bodies, saw Boone bleeding, saw the girl kneeling like a storm had passed through her and made her steel. "Well," he said, calm as death, "ain't there something?" Tessa stood, rifle raised. Boone reached for her arm. "Don't," he said, voice faint. "Not yet." Kane stopped 10 paces away, eyes fixed on Boone. "I should have killed you in Waco," he said, "but maybe this is better." Tessa didn't lower the rifle. And Boone closed his eyes, blood soaking into the floor. The night went still, the air sharp with gunpowder and fate, and the wind at last began to howl. Dawn broke over the ruins in slow gold streaks, casting long shadows across the shattered bones of the church. The smoke had thinned, the earth had quieted, but the weight of what lingered still pressed against the ribs. Tessa stood alone in the doorway, rifle in hand, boots steady in the ash. Rufus Kane circled just beyond the altar, fingers twitching near the revolver on his hip. His eyes never left her, not for fear, but for calculation. He knew what he'd made her into. He just didn't know what she'd learned. "You're just a girl," he said, the words worn from too much use. She said nothing. Let him speak. Let him assume. "You think you're ready?" He smiled, crooked and slow. "You think you know how this ends?" "I do," she said, calm as frost. He raised his pistol fast. She didn't flinch. A blinding flash caught his eye, the sun striking a mirror set in the broken rafters behind her. For 1 second, he turned instinctively, blinded by light. That was enough. She dove to the side, just as Boone had taught her. No hesitation, no wasted breath. Her hand reached down into the rubble where, hours before, she'd buried the second rifle. A clean movement, practiced, quiet, deadly. She rolled onto one knee and fired. The bullet struck Kane in the thigh. Not a kill shot, but it dropped him hard. He roared, snarling, gun skidding across the stone. She stood slowly, the rifle steady in her hands, heart pounding like a war drum. He tried to crawl for the weapon. She stepped on his wrist. "Don't," she said. He froze, staring up at her. Blood seeped through his trousers. His breath came in shallow bursts. A cough came from behind the altar. Boone's voice was cracked, dry as the canyon wind. "Tessa." She turned. Boone had dragged himself upright, leaning against the altar, pale as death but still breathing. His revolver was in his lap, hand curled tight around the grip. His eyes met hers, calm, clear, proud. "Step aside," he said. She did. Boone raised the revolver with the strength of everything he had left. No ceremony. No last words. He aimed true. The gunshot echoed off the canyon walls like the end of a song. Rufus' cane jerked once, then fell back, eyes wide and empty. The wind returned, dry and hollow, stirring ash around his body. Tessa knelt beside Boone. Blood soaked the stone beneath him, but he was still holding on. He looked at her like a man seeing sunlight for the first time in years. "You did good," he whispered. "You did better." A faint smile pulled at his cracked lips. Maybe it wasn't all wasted then. She pressed a hand to his shoulder, eyes shining but unbroken. Later, when the sun was high and the blood dried into the floor, riders came from the north. Dusty, badge-wearing men led by a sheriff with a face full of weather and a voice full of questions. The trader Boone had helped stood with them, arm in a sling, had clutched tight. He told them what happened. Told them about the girl, the ambush, the fire. Told them Boone Harlan didn't run, not this time. The sheriff nodded. He looked at Boone, half-conscious and tied together with willpower and blood, and said, "Reckon that clears some things." Boone didn't answer. He was already drifting, his eyes fixed on the open sky beyond the rafters. They stayed in Calico Flats for 3 days. The sheriff offered Boone a ride to a doctor, but he refused. Said he had enough hands dragging him through the dirt. Said if it was his time, he'd meet it standing, or not at all. On the 4th morning, he was gone. No one saw him ride out. No one saw which trail he took. Just tracks in the sand, heading west. Some said he died not far from the ruins, buried under wild sage and marked with stones. Others swore they saw him weeks later, in the hills near Sonora, trading bullets with bounty hunters. A few claimed he took a new name and kept riding, chasing something only he could see. But none of them could say for sure. Tessa never went back to her people. Too many ghosts. Too much silence. Instead, she rode east until the land turned softer and green things grew again. She bought a plot near River Bend, built a small ranch with money earned from hunting, guiding, and protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. They called her Miss Tessa, or just the girl with a rifle. She wore her revolver low and her hat tilted sharp. Folks said she shot cleaner than any man west of the Divide. And some nights, by the fire, when the wind was just right and the stars were bright enough to remember, she told the tale of a man named Boone. A man who'd done terrible things, then something good. A man who broke every rule to bring her back. They didn't speak his name loud, not in daylight, but in whispers. They told it like a legend, like a prayer. Boone Harlan, the outlaw who vanished into dust and shadow, but left behind a girl strong enough to stand.